don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I talked with George Lilley. As you'll hear, George is a mostly retired high school math teacher from Melbourne, Australia, with over 40 years of experience in education. George shares his unique perspective, having taught in various countries and witnessed firsthand the evolution of educational mandates. We talked about the science of learning discourse quite a bit, but started with his critical examination of John Hattie's visible learning work, his methodologies, and their impact on teaching practices. We discussed the nuances of educational research, the challenges of student engagement in diverse classrooms, and the importance of critical inquiry in advancing our understanding of effective teaching. Our conversation also touched upon the underrepresentation of key cognitive load theory researchers like Slava Kalyuga in the popular discourse. Slava's work on complex learning offers valuable insights that seem to be overlooked by many in the science of learning camp. I've reached out to Slava for a podcast chat, but have yet to receive a positive response. In the meantime, you might find my September 25th blog post referencing his work titled Rethinking Cognitive Load Theory with Complex Learning of interest, and we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes. It's probably not much of a surprise, but George and I also expressed concerns about tribalism in educational discussions, advocating for open dialogue and critical inquiry over rigid adherence to unchallenged claims. On that note, some of you may follow me on social media, and one thing I've done quite a bit of over the years is to poke and prod those who seem to make claims about teaching and learning with certainty. Most of the time, I'm looking for a dialectical exchange, not particularly looking to persuade others, but to better understand how others are thinking. And it struck me recently that this is probably not the expectation and norm for others, especially on Twitter/X, where it seems many are expecting some sort of debate. And that sometimes leads to more friction than I am interested in, so it's likely that I'll be trying to step back a bit from social media, especially X, as I'm not really very interested in arguing and creating friction, and am finding those interactions less and less like the learning opportunities and constructive discussion that I prefer. With all of that said, I invite you to check out our website, which is wegrowteachers.com. You'll see some changes and tweaks there lately. We're still looking forward to releasing our AI PBL design Copilot tool and a differentiated instruction online course, but we're making the final tweaks to those as we speak. All of our professional learning and workshops are still available there. Of course, you can go to Workshops and Services in the menu, and you'll see the variety of offerings that we have there, as well as the blogs and this podcast. If you want to reach out to me directly, feel free to do that by email. My email address is drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with George. I am with George Lilley, and I want to give him the opportunity to introduce himself and give the listeners a little background on who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Yeah, my name's George. I'm been a teacher in Melbourne since 1980. I did my teacher training in the late 70s, so it's quite a long time ago. So I've been mostly a high school teacher for the last 40 years, although I've done a few stints in other countries. In America, I was in Seal Beach in, I think it was 1993. Then I was in Amsterdam for a year in 1990. And in England in the late 90s. So I've sort of taught maths in a range of different places. So that's where a lot of my experience comes from, is that maths teaching in high school. I semi-retired about 2 years ago, so I'm now mostly doing admin stuff for schools. So I do school timetables and daily org. So it's getting towards 7 o'clock in the morning here in Melbourne. So I'll probably start getting some calls at about 7:30. Teachers will be absent, and then I have to find replacements, and sometimes I have to go in and take some classes. So my role these days is mostly administrative, so I'm sort of out of the classroom most of the time. But I've had an interest in evidence because our state has probably been one of the few states that have really mandated certain evidence types in the last 30 years. So that's where the Hattie thing starts, and my analysis of Hattie's work. So I got really interested in that because it was sort of mandated from the state to all government high schools.
So you said you've been teaching for just a short time, 40 years or so.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I think sometimes I ask this partly because I think it adds some color to the conversation. What your here in the States we call it K-12. What your educational experience was like as a kid growing up. What kind of teaching, if you can recall, any sort of trends or things that you were exposed to, and then any of your pre-service sort of teacher training and what that was like.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, I just went to a suburban high school just up the road from here, just near La Trobe University. So actually at the time, there were big teacher shortages like there is today. So we had a lot of American teachers come over to fill spots. So I really like all the math subjects. So I remember we had a Californian sort of hippie guy. I still remember his name, Eddie Vaughan. So if Eddie Vaughan is still out there, I really enjoyed that year 9 maths class. But most of it was, direct instruction. It was, I remember one teacher we'd sit in the room and he would just write notes on the board for the 50 minutes non-stop. And you would have to just copy the notes into your workbook. And that was like every lesson for the whole year. That's what we did. And then I did my teacher training. I did a Bachelor of Applied Science in Human Movement, which is a fancy name for a PE. So I did that. Then I then went on and did another degree in maths. All of the math stuff has always been really the worked examples type of teaching. So that's what I sort of grew up with. Although in the teaching method side of things, we had some great mentors that showed us different ways to teach. And but most of the time it was some form of direct instruction. There's only one case that I had where I had this, the teacher would just come in or the lecturer would come in and just give a big problem and then walk out and then leave all the students to solve. That was second year maths at La Trobe Uni. I found that gave me an introduction to this unsupervised problem-based learning. I didn't like it very much because it was, number one, it's a lot of work because you have to do a lot of reading but there's a lot of group work and all that sort of stuff. I learned quite a bit, but I think it is inefficient. I'd be preferred to be guided a little bit more. And then since then, high schools and I think this is the thing with the science of learning. A lot of the things I hear on the podcast seems to be mostly about early primary school or elementary school, which is very, very different to my high school experience. Most of the time, in fact, all of the time, there's been a textbook. Textbooks seem to be designed, with science of learning principles, breaking things into small concepts, modeling, worked examples, giving kids practice, interleaving later on, like that. They tend to be the textbooks that most people have used. So this sort of emphasis that everybody's doing problem-based learning is sort of, I've not seen that.
Yeah.
But I can talk about some experiences in various schools with regard to, like those styles of teaching that have really influenced me. But we can talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, I want to get to some of the thinking and things that you and I have exchanged, and I've seen from you on social media about cognitive load theory and science of learning. Before we get there, and obviously it's pretty pretty closely related. I'm trying to remember when you first came on my radar, and it's been quite some time. And it was probably in response to I've talked with John Hattie twice now on the podcast, actually, technically, I think 3 times, because he and I did 2 sessions on his Visible Learning, the sequel. And then there was one with he and his son. And I probably was, mentioning things about it, and you have an interesting, sort of tendency to push back on the Hattie stuff. And so, I'm curious to have you unpack some of your concerns and critiques of John Hattie. I don't know that they're necessarily terribly unique. There's definitely I've seen some and talked with him about some of those. And he, if people have read his latest, I think it's his latest book, the sequel, he takes on a few of those, and we talked a bit about those kinds of things. My biggest interest, or the thing that I like about John Hattie's work, is the surface deepened transfer kind of concept, and then I think he calls it teach with intent, or intent to teach, and how that sort of dispels some of the things that we'll probably talk about later with the science of learning and cognitive science and inquiry versus direct or explicit instruction and some of those kinds of things. But all that long-winded way to ask you to sort of unpack maybe what is what are the big critiques and things that you want to share about Hattie's work?
Well, there's a lot of critiques. That's one of the things I tried to do, because my state, sort of about 12 or so years ago, designed a teaching and learning model that was based on Hattie's original book, Visible Learning. So that was sort of a mandate that was handed down, and it sort of went unquestioned. And
that book, I think, is 2001, right?
2009.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of his earlier papers, which people should look at, is the power of feedback. I think that was about 2003. That's probably one of the most widely read. Who was it? Hattie and Timperley. That was often given it to us to read. It's got a lot of mistakes in it that I wish people would pick up, but a lot of really simple arithmetic errors and that sort of thing. But I guess my experience was, I was the timetabler at this particular school, and one of Hattie's big claims is class size doesn't matter, he used to say that. He sort of denies he says that now, but I've kept videos and those sorts of things because he tends to change what he says depending upon which audience he's speaking to. But anyway, I mean, the class size thing was a big thing, because most teachers would say that class size matters. So I just decided, and our principal was sort of hitting us over the head with Hattie's book, telling us, this is the science, this is what we've got to do. It was almost like, I think you interviewed Andrew Watson a little while ago. He talked about teachers being hit over the head with evidence, to make them conform. And that's what I felt. And so I just decided to go and have a look at, okay, what are the studies? So Hattie reports 3 studies, and then all 3 of them actually report that class size matters. And I'm thinking, well, how does Hattie say it doesn't matter, or that it doesn't matter much? And then, in fact, the biggest study, that Gene Glass, who actually invented the meta-analysis technique, it actually says that class size matters a lot. But Hattie didn't mention that at all in his narrative. So that sort of sparked my interest. So I looked into, his top. I then looked into his top-ranked influence, which is self-report grades. So I looked at the background studies, and then I realised most of them had nothing to do with what Hattie claimed. Like the studies didn't actually measure what Hattie said that they measured. Then I looked at feedback, and once again, I think there was 20. I've written this all on my blog, the details. There are 23 feedback studies, and virtually none of them sort of talked about feedback in the way that Hattie, defined feedback. Like, it was actually quite ridiculous. Like, what the biggest study was about background music. So Hattie used background music as a form of feedback, but that's not really. And it was a study about a range of things, like background music in a production line, background music in a nursing home, which would calm residents. And I thought, well, that's got nothing to do with feedback in a classroom. So there's that level of critique about whether the studies actually talking about the things that Hattie says they're talking about. There's that layer of really big problems with Hattie's work. The other problems with his work are just the calculations. There's just a lot of calculation errors that a lot of peer reviews have picked up, but most teachers aren't aware of them. For example, his probability calculations, he gets negative probabilities, and he gets probabilities greater than 100%. Now, he explains that away. I think he explained that away in your podcast. He said he mistakenly put the wrong spreadsheet in at the last minute. But if you actually read the chapters, the misunderstanding of probability is written into the narrative. So I've given examples where he tries to explain a probability and it's completely wrong. So there's that level of mistakes that I think is concerning. So what I've done is I've just tried to detail some of the peer reviews and just get people to look at it. And one of the things in our state that's a little bit related to Hattie's surface, deep and transfer types of learning is that we used to have this notion of high order thinking skills, and part of that was critical thinking and analysis. So I was trying to use that to say, well, as teachers, we ought to be doing that with the evidence that we've been given. So the whole attempt of the blog is just to highlight that if you critically think and analyze Hattie's work, there's a whole range of problems come up, and then to use Hattie's work as a mandate from the state. I mean, there's real problems with that, and I think my state's been an experiment with Hattie's work, and in my opinion, it's failed badly.
So I think the first issue that you raise, about the different kinds of studies, I think that seems to me, and I'm not somebody, I'm familiar with research. I'm not somebody who has conducted research. I don't know, the methodology well enough to go deep on it. But what I've seen is critique of the sort of meta-analysis approach that's kind of a fairly would it be fair to say that's a common problem, not just of Hattie, but of other meta-analyses? They're trying to find and pull together a number of studies that are closely enough related to be able to, I guess in Hattie's case, give some effect size or to make some recommendations or some conclusions, and that's inherently challenging because research it's not aligned to any particular, I guess poll or whatever you want to say. People do all kinds of different research, and when you read the different research, you say, well, this study did this study was a little bit different from that, and so how wide is that range? How wide a range is acceptable in order to make it, I guess, valid and reliable, and or invalid and unreliable?
Yeah, it's a good question. The important thing to understand about Hattie's work, and that's another thing I've been trying to talk about, is that Hattie's not doing usually a meta-analysis. The protocols are that, you've got a whole bunch of studies that you look at, and then you've got to have some selection criteria, very specific selection criteria as to what studies will belong to your meta-analysis, and you should have a rationale for including or excluding studies. So that's the typical meta-analysis protocol. So what you're meant to be doing is collecting studies on a particular theme that are all consistent or all, reasonably consistent. Hattie's method is very different. He's not doing a meta-analysis. He's doing a meta-analysis, which is a very different. So what he's doing is collecting meta-analysis that have already done that, and then all he's then doing is averaging the effect sizes, or one effect size from that meta-analysis to get an average effect size. But Hattie hasn't got this protocol of an inclusion or an exclusion criteria. So there's a lot of people have written about that. That's a big flaw in itself, in that and it was one of the earlier critiques in 2010 was that Hattie has not got any quality criteria about what to include and what to exclude. And I think you see that now in this recent, his recent article about learning styles, because in his visible learning database, he's consistently had he started, I think, with 7 meta-analysis that give an effect size of about 0.4. So according to his paradigm, 0.4 is, useful and worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Till today, I checked last night, he's got 18 meta-analysis in that database now, and the effect size is still about 0.4. And the recommendation on the website is that learning styles has a small positive effect. And you mentioned in your last interview with him that he's added this extra indicator called the robust indicator, and the learning styles has the highest value of 5, meaning that these studies are highly robust. In other words, that they really represent learning styles. But then earlier this year, he's written a paper that he's pulled he's picked 17 studies, and he's pulled the 17 studies apart in that they don't measure learning styles, or there's some other method, flaw in their method. So to me, it's like, how can you have on the one hand your website promoting learning styles and then a different paper pulling all those studies apart? So he's sort of admitting that his inclusion criteria is flawed, which is what people were saying in 2010.
I hadn't seen that piece that you're referring to about learning styles, and that's a curious one because, of course, and sometimes I joke, you may have heard me, or seen me on social media. I mean, there's almost, I can't think of another thing that triggers science of learning advocates anything more than the mention of learning styles. And of course, Carl and Jim Heel and I think Paul Kirshner wrote the Instructional Illusions book, which I have, and hopefully we'll have them on the podcast to talk about that. But learning styles is a myth is the one of the mantras of the science of learning. So I guess it's interesting if I'm understanding you correctly, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, that at least in some places he's saying that learning styles has some sort of an effect that's worth paying attention to, which would be contradictory to the science of learning and that sort of mindset. But I guess it's what's curious to me is that if the things that you're mentioning, which I don't have any reason to doubt the veracity of them, and I think some other folks have raised similar concerns and some more, I guess, inflammatory concerns about plagiarism and things like that. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or want to comment on that, but that that John seems to be still a part of that group, of the sort of science of learning group. There's the knowledge rich curriculum document and book that they put out, and he was a part of that. And so I find that an interesting, I guess, just a wrinkle in terms of Paul Kirshner, as I'm sure you well know, is I wouldn't imagine would be too I mean, I would think that he's pretty particular about numbers and some of the things and concerns that you raise, but to be collaborating with him, I find that just to be interesting, and there's no question there other than just an observation.
Yeah. Well, you can look up his website. So he might say that someone else is in charge of that website. He probably will say that, although he said before that he's the quality control guy, that he's guaranteed that there's a quality control. So, but what I've done, I've seen that from the Science of Learning people, and I've posted just a screenshot of the 18 meta-analysis and his summary that's on the website. And I've also shown them the visible learning because he's got 7 meta-analysis in there. usually, no one's really responded to any of that. It's usually just ignored. There's no discussion about it, which I find disappointing because, Hattie's probably one of the prominent evidence-based people. And it's back to that theme before of my government or state government mandating Hattie's work, but then no one's allowed to criticise it. I don't think, that's certainly not the scientific way of doing things. There should be open debate. Another example is the feedback. The 23 feedback studies that he originally had, he's removed, and there was almost a similar study in 2020 called Feedback Revisited. So I've got all this documented on my blog site so people can check it, and if there's a mistake, then no one's found a mistake yet. Not saying I haven't made one, but what I've tried to do is look at the studies in detail and find issues that people can check. Those original 23 feedback studies, the one that I'm talking about that had music as background, well, they've now been removed from his website, but they've been removed quietly, which bothers me a little bit. I think because there's been criticism that these studies, in fact, the feedback studies, there's been quite a few peer reviews showing that they, Robert Slavin's done some work before he passed away, showing that Hattie mixed up the positive and negative sign on the effect sizes. So mistakes, as like that, are riddled throughout the book. So in Feedback Revisited, it was a 2020 article, I think, most of those studies have been removed because for the same reason I said before, that they're not looking at feedback from the point of view of feedback in a classroom or the way that feedback is defined by Hattie. So that's just another example that people can look up. And people should just look up the class size thing. Have a look at Jen Glass's study on class size and just read it. It's like, it says the opposite of what Hattie says.
Yeah. Well, I want to, one question, and some folks maybe, if they're listening, they may have a question, because if I missed it, I apologize, but I don't recall, as you're talking about your introduction, talking about, like, how did you get this expertise and research methods and what, basically being able to critique these things? Because some people may say, well, how does he know what's, good methods and all that kind of stuff?
Sure. Well, I've done a maths, IT and stats degree at La Trobe Uni. But the stats involved in meta-analysis aren't that hard. It's like to calculate an effect size is a really simple calculation. The issue is with effect sizes, there's lots of ways to calculate an effect size. So one example I've given in the blog is that the measuring stick for an effect size is the standard deviation. So, that's just stuff that you study in high school, really. It's really year 11 and 12 maths here, and that's the level of maths that you need to understand effect sizes. But I give it, well, actually, Gene Glass has written a paper that you can read, and he talks about the problem of the standard deviation, because the standard deviation is like your ruler. It's like measuring something with an American ruler in feet and then saying 1 foot is the same as 1 meter that we'd measure by. The unit is different. You can't say that one equals this, your 1 foot equals our 1 meter. And that's what is really happening when you compare effect sizes, because when people calculate an effect size, they use a standard deviation, but there's at least 4 ways to calculate a standard deviation. So depending on which standard deviation you use, it's like you're using a different ruler, a different unit. So that's one level of, you can't compare effect sizes from different studies unless all of that's the same. One of the best critiques I've seen of Hattie is by a guy, an English professor called Adrian Simpson, and he goes through the calculations as well. He was one of the first people to pick up that Hattie had calculated negative probabilities in his work. So, but he writes a paper which I think, this is part of teaching as well. Like, effect sizes can be complicated. So how do you explain them in a way that people can understand? I found that difficult, but Adrian Simpson came up with an analogy, and he's written a paper that headed "Princesses are bigger than elephants," and he uses the analogy of a photograph and measuring the size of a princess and an elephant on a photograph. So if you just measure the sizes, you can come up with the conclusion that princesses are bigger than elephants. So he uses that as an analogy of comparing different effect sizes. But in order to compare effect sizes, if you're doing photographs, you need to know how far was the photographer from the object when they made the photograph, because that's going to affect the size on the photo. So he uses those sorts of analogies to show that just comparing effect sizes where you don't have that information is faulty, which is precisely what Hattie does. He just gets any old effect sizes, doesn't worry how they're calculated, and just compares them like you would say that 1 foot equals 1 meter. And he's now, I think, Hattie's pulled away, and there's a few people who've written about this too. He's pulled away from that original notion in visible learning, which is an important thing for people to remember. What was Hattie saying in visible learning? What was his message? Because there's a whole range of different messages. So I try and just simplify it. Hattie had a very clever concept. What he was saying was everything works. Everything works in education. I don't know if you remember, he would say this a lot. Everything works in education. All you need is a pulse. I thought it was a bit derogatory to teachers, but he would say that a lot. And then he would say, we don't need to know what works. We need to know what works best. How do you work out what works best? Well, we've got this thing called a meta-analysis and effect sizes. So the effect size determines what's best. And then he made that ranking chart of the highest effect sizes at the top down to, like the lowest ones at the bottom. So although he now says that was a mistake, he regrets that he put that chart in there. So I don't know about that. I think that was the whole message of the book, is that those things at the top work best and those things at the bottom don't work. So that's the clear message in visible learning. He's pulled away from that now. Now he's changed it to a narrative, to the story. He says a lot now. It's not the numbers, it's the story. Well, that's a complete contradiction of the theme of visible learning, the original visible learning. I think he's cleverly moved away from that, and he's writing about what you picked up on, the deep and transfer and those sorts of things. I think has captured a different market, and I think there's a little bit of evidence there for what he's saying, although I think those things are very hard to measure. Like surface learning is hard to measure, let alone deep and transfer. They're all things that are very, very hard to measure, and that depending upon how you measure them, you get different results. I mean, you get that even, and Dylan Wiliam talks about this a lot, even surface learning, depending upon how you measure it, you can get a completely different result. So yeah. I don't know. I just hope people, have a bit of a critical thinking about all this.
Yeah, well, that gets to maybe the answer for the question that I was going to ask. And, I think it's important that people understand, the purpose of having a conversation like this, which is not to, at least in at least from my side, I don't speak for yourself, I don't put words in your mouth, but to, discredit or to say, John Hattie's a bad person or anything like that, but to critique, because that's the way that science works. And, one of the things that is part of our podcast and is I think in the beginning is don't block the way of inquiry. And so we should have those, continue to have those conversations and ask those hard questions and give Hattie or whoever else we're critiquing the chance to respond to it, which is a hard thing to do because, he doesn't necessarily have to, and he's, in different forms, and getting a conversation with him about those things is not as easy as one might hope. But the value, like you mentioned, the surface deep and transfer is something that I find a really valuable sort of paradigm and way to think about teaching and learning, and in our professional development work, I use that as a sort of framework. And sometimes people talk about depths of knowledge, and there's probably other ways to talk about it that are useful. But I do think that that's useful, and I do think that there's a lot of value to John's work. So I guess you kind of alluded to it, I think, is before, is like, thinking critically about his work or anybody's work. Are there any other goals or things that are sort of things that you would really hope would be outcomes or people would do with regard to John Hattie's work before we get into a little bit more of the science of learning, cognitive load theory, and that kind of thing?
I think with Hattie's work, as with the science of learning stuff, is to check, people will cite evidence and to check it. The problem is people haven't got time. So that's the issue. And then what we tend to do is we tend to assign that responsibility to someone that we trust. So, I mean, you see that in the science of learning a lot, that people often get they'll use someone else's opinion, and they won't. So I don't know what the answer to that problem is, but because that's another theme that in the time that I've been reading all this stuff is you just see how disparate all the research is. I think a study came out a couple of weeks ago saying there's 140,000 peer-reviewed educational research articles every year. So who's going to have the time to read all those? And then who do we trust to put all those together? Who do we trust to interpret that and give us a clear picture about what's going on? And I've also on my blog, I've tried to investigate that just by looking at the various organisations that we do trust, and then like you've got the What Works Clearinghouse, which tends to be a very rigorous organisation. I'm not sure. I've heard that apparently Trump's shutting all that down. I'm not sure, which would be a shame. Then you've got the English Educational Endowment Foundation, which is a huge organisation. Then we've got our AERO, Australian Education Research Organisation here, which has been a bit of controversy over. Then you've got your individuals like John Hattie, Robert Marzano, all those sorts of people. Then you've got your John Swallers in that group. So who do you trust? Who do you trust to represent the studies for you? And they all come up with different conclusions. So that was one of my questions, is how come, if the evidence is so straightforward and obvious, how come these organisations come up with different emphases? They often contradict each other. I mean, another example of a contradiction with the science of learning and Hattie is teacher subject knowledge. Hattie says that's not important, or it's got a low effect size, so he's puzzled why it's not, whereas the science of learning people, and I also agree with the science of learning people, that subject matter knowledge is really, really important.
Mm.
But visible learning, it's got one of the lowest effect sizes in the list. So predictions, you should be thinking about, I think you should be thinking about that.
Yeah, well, and those kinds of things that create some cognitive dissonance are, to your point, I think what we should be using to say, well, wait, you say this, and then I'm reading this. I'm case in point, I'm currently reading the book by I don't know if you know Timothy Shanahan, talking about leveled readers.
Yes.
And one of the things that I noticed there that I thought, well, that's really interesting, and I have not yet talked with him, but he'll be on the podcast hopefully soon, and we're going to talk about that. But one of the things that I noticed in the reading, and it's, as I understand, I'm not through the book yet, but is alluding to the idea that instead of having students read books that are at their instructional level, basically their reading level. So if I'm a third grade reading level, but I'm in fifth grade, I should read a book that's at third grade reading level. His assertion is, again, I'm not finished with the book yet, but that students, if they're on a third grade reading level, they should actually be reading a fifth grade reading level, which to me sounds totally in contradiction with cognitive load theory, because that's much harder, right? It's and I think he's, going to talk about, as I read through the book a little bit more, the ways in which teachers then should teach to support and scaffold, somebody who's reading a book that's above reading level. But one of the quotes that he cites in the book, and I don't know these two, maybe you know them, Richard Schmidt and Robert A. Bjork, professors of psychology at the University of UCLA. The quote is, "Manipulations that maximize performance during training can be detrimental in the long term. Conversely, manipulations that degrade the speed of acquisition can support the long-term goals of training," which to me is absolutely opposite from sort of cognitive load theory, right? And that's just really curious, and it raises so many great questions. I know you sent me, I think, the paper from Slava, and I'm going to probably Kalyuga and Anne-Marie Singh, and this is rethinking the boundaries of cognitive load theory in complex learning. And I thought, well, this is just fascinating. It's 2015, and he's making the case for differences in academic outcomes, which is the point that I feel like I hammer home and try to beat. There are different outcomes that teachers might have that are more than just what I would call surface learning, that knowledge. There are academic outcomes. How do you make meaning of things? Are there academic virtues? I would argue, and we can talk about that critical thinking, a generalized critical thinking, as opposed to domain-specific critical thinking, is an outcome that is definitely worth teaching to, even though it doesn't show up very quickly and is qualitative and harder to measure. So, again, no question there, but it's just sort of a platter for you to talk about some of those things.
Yeah, that's one of the. I mean, we've seen each other's tweets on X. One of the big things that I notice is that, the Slava Kalugas and there's a whole bunch of other people, the cognitive load researchers, you don't hear their voices very much. They've written papers that you have to go and find and read them, and they're often
and you should, if you don't mind, give a little bit of I don't know if genealogy is the right word, but it's not like Slava Kalyuga is somebody who doesn't have connections to some of the names that we certainly see in these conversations.
He's very connected to those people that we all know. But yeah, I mean, he's probably, as we've discussed before, he's probably not someone that wants to be in the limelight all the time. So he very rarely does interviews, and so it'd be great if you could get him on to do an interview.
Yeah, which I am trying. Yeah.
So, I mean, when you read his writing, and there's another key researcher, Van Marenda, I might have not pronounced his name correctly. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago, but he's also written some really interesting stuff as well that you don't hear much about. So what I often see is that those figures' writings aren't represented in the dialogues, at least on X, in the popular science of learning dialogues. They're and sometimes I'll post them, and usually they're just ignored. So Kalyuga talks about your different instructional goals in complex learning, which is a really important theme. Van Marenda, he talks about how does cognitive load theory translate to a year-long course. So here in Melbourne, as a maths teacher, you would have those kids for the whole year. You might have them almost for 50 minutes each day, or for 5 days a week, or maybe 4 days a week. It depends on the school. So you've got to engage those kids for the whole year. So one of his papers tries to deal with that question about how do you engage kids for the whole year, given that there's this cognitive load theory. Well, that opens up another aspect of complex learning and engagement that I don't see discussed on X in the popular channels, and that to at least promote some of those papers and those discussions is really important, but they're not being promoted. So I see that as an issue, that but some of the key researchers' work is not being promoted at all. And I think because they temper some of the exaggeration that we see, you know.
Yeah, I feel like there's just I guess a level of tribalism that I chalk it up to. I don't know if you chalk it up to something different, and it is, I think, so very strange. I've probably mentioned it on the podcast a few times, but I'm collaborating on a paper with Cindy Nebel to try to make a call for less of that tribalism, right? So recognizing that the ways in which some of the voices and I what I see mostly on X or on social media outside of X is from the explicit direct instruction crowd, the folks and we don't need to name names because we just don't need to, but if anybody's involved in those conversations, they probably could guess who some of those names are. And I don't think they're wrong. I just don't think I think they're missing some things or not talking about some things. And it has become, for some, so tribal and so, the point is not necessarily just to say what they believe is right, but what everybody else who has a different opinion or I would say I agree with this, but I think it's yes and, but that's not acceptable, and that feels so very much like the sort of partisan, political, tribal partisanship we have here in the States, and hopefully is not spreading too much like wildfire around the world. But I don't have much faith in that. So, I mean, is it tribalism for you? Would you attribute it to tribalism or something different?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. I guess I think I would call it tribalism. I don't think it's. I mean, an example is there are key people that present their science of learning views on X, and what I find is that they're never challenged, and I don't think that's healthy. Like, there are lots of mistakes that those people make. I mean, you only have to do a little bit of research. I mean, an example was the pylon and the vitriol thrown to Rachel Jefferson, who you had on a little while ago, that she just had an opinion piece that, okay, so I don't agree with that. Like what you said, I don't agree with everything that she said, but she made some points that I thought were relevant. Like, one of the points was about human movement, embodied cognition, that the science of learning folks don't acknowledge that. And then she was really hit on the head about that and some other things. And it's like, I try to point out to a bunch of people that had a go at Rachel that Sweller's actually added embodied cognition in his 2019 update. It's like, so those people weren't representing cognitive load theory as defined by Sweller. And then, of course, you get no response, no discussion, no dialogue. And then no one within that group had picked that up. And another couple of claims that I try and challenge is the claim that direct instruction works for everyone. There's a bunch of people that have said that. That's never challenged. So I've asked, can you give me 2 studies that show that direct instruction works for everyone? Most of the time I'm ignored, or by one of our friends I've been blocked. That's a reasonable question. Then, there's a bunch of claims. The other claim that I think is challenged is this: there's a consensus of evidence. Once again, if you look at Sweller's, one of his recent papers, he talks about the crisis in reproducing results and the contradictions. So he talks about how he's had to change the theory because of all these contradictory evidence. So that gives a very different narrative as to whether there's a consensus or not. So all of those things, they're the 3 key things to challenge, I think. And then cognitive load theories. I mean, I like Christian Bookove. He's got good insights because I think he's got a knowledge of studies that most of us haven't got the time to read. So he'll often show studies that contradict. And he mentioned that in your podcast. And the people within those groups, don't worry about any of that, and that concerns me a bit.
Yeah. Well, and you don't want to generalize because we're talking about a large group of people, and there's individuals, and some are better actors, some are more considerate. Some of them have been on my podcast and are, I think, while I might have some minor disagreements or wonders about, again, like with critical thinking, they're willing to entertain the conversation, maybe on social media less than in a podcast or something like that, but at least like I had Jim Heel and Rebecca Berlin on to talk about mental models, and they were willing to have that conversation and be pushed a little bit, and Rebecca even put on LinkedIn or something about, it was a juicy conversation, and, which is great, right? Those are the kinds of conversations that we want to foster and have. But then there's a group of people that, and I would say in some ways on both sides, that are very intolerant, very resistant to getting into the nuance. And I've joked about it before, but, there's one person on X who literally called me a menace for trying to push for a little bit more nuance, and I just thought that's just amusing. I mean, I guess I'll take it as a badge of honor to be a menace, but these sort of tweets or messages that resonate with a group of people, and again, I think there are some people on the inquiry side and the constructivist side who fit that bill to some extent, and I try to push back on them as well. And you mentioned Rachel, as you said. I told Rachel, I was like, it's not how I would do it. I wouldn't, say things are soul destroying, and really up the ante on if you watch her social media feed, it's can be a little inflammatory, and I don't think that's particularly productive, even if I might agree with a lot of what she might say. And so trying to sort of tone it down and be a little bit more, at least aim for something a little bit more dispassionate, a little bit more disinterested, and trying to ask, and ironically, I think this is a problem with some of the science and learning people, is that especially the ones who denigrate inquiry and say inquiry is bad and conflate inquiry and discovery learning, is that I think that they probably need some inquiry skills. And one of those things is continually asking the question or versions of the question of, is this true, right? Or how is this true? How might this be true? In what cases might this be true? And different versions of that. So, having the conversation with people who are uninterested in asking that kind of question regularly is definitely frustrating. Feel free to comment on that, but I also I'm curious, when you talk about, because you talked about the importance of direct instruction, and you're talking about I think interleaving. I don't know if you mentioned retrieval practice, but worked examples and all these kinds of things as a math teacher. How do you recommend, if you're talking with a teacher who you're trying to help and support, how do you recommend they sort of navigate cognitive science, science of learning, all of those kinds of things, and perhaps the use of something more like inquiry, not discovery learning, but something more like inquiry?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, most of the time, we're using maths textbooks, and I think maths textbooks are an efficient way to deliver a course. But so, I mean, we've been doing that for years. So the issues that usually arise, and it's what I talked about before, having the kids for the whole year, that there's an engagement problem. So my involvement with all of this, I mean, my original involvement was with Hattie was, I honestly wanted to find techniques that would make me a better teacher. I think that's most people's motivation. And then when I started to see how disparate the research was, it sort of, I became a little bit cynical. But and now in these discussions with the science of learning people, my motivation's the same. It's like, is there anything that they can tell me that's going to improve my teaching other than what I'm already doing? And I haven't really, to be honest, in all of the debates and to and fro's that I've had, I've not really found much that really helps me other than what I'm already doing. The only things I've really found, you had Ollie Caviglioli on. He talks about, is it Fred Jones, his visual implementation plan about worked examples. That is a really helpful technique. It's a little video. And Ollie talks about how he's surprised the science of learning people haven't picked it up. That sort of stuff I find helpful. There's another guy I read a lot, Michael Persian. I think he's a maths teacher up in New York. He's written a book of worked examples that really go. He's written some stuff about worked examples and also about feedback that I've, from a classroom perspective, that is really helpful. I mean, I'd recommend teachers go and see those things. In terms of the science of learning, the only thing I've seen, I know there are schools that have common slides that I've been part of schools like that where you've got 10 classes at a year level and that everybody has to sort of be on the same page at the same time each week and they have the same assessments. I'm involved in that sort of thing as well, and that's, you know, some of the key science of learning people promote that way, and, you know, they've got common slides that they work through, and I've had a look at some of those and they're very close to the textbooks that we use. In fact, a lot of it looks like it's been copied from textbooks that I've seen, but I haven't really gotten much to help me out of that. In terms of my teaching experience, I've been to a few difficult schools which is a problem that the science of learning people don't talk about, is this engagement. When you've got kids, because maths is mandatory, they don't want to be there. So direct instruction doesn't work all the time for those sorts of kids. You've got to have some other tools in your bag. And I know there's this argument against balance. I wouldn't argue for a balance. I would just argue that you need other tools in your bag to deal with the various situations that you come across. So in one school just down the road from here, it's sort of the school had a lot of African refugees, but it was mixed in with Australians and a lot of Lebanese, Italian, Greek, and there was a lot of racial tension at the schools. It was a really difficult school. And I had I don't know what's equivalent to in America, but year 8 and year 9, like the 13, 14-year-old kids, you know, trying to teach them maths every day. And it was really difficult, you know, trying to get the kids to pay attention. And I remember one day trying to teach Pythagoras' theory, and I just couldn't. The kids were in one corner, you know, mucking about, and just every day was like this. And the behaviour guru at the time was a guy called Bill Rogers. Actually, that was my first sort of foray into evidence-based, and he had all these techniques of dealing with that. And he used to have those VHS tapes, and he would, you know, act out various scenarios. And I looked at all of that to try and improvement, and none of it worked. None of it could control. None of those techniques could control these kids. One thing happened though, that the school ended up making this thing called the Maths Task Centre, and so they realised engagement was a bit of a problem. So we used to have this thing called the Maths Task Centre, and you could buy, I think there's about 300 small problems, inquiry-based sort of tasks, like the Hanoi Tower. They're like 5-minute problems that the kids can do. So they employed a teacher's aide to organise a room with those around about 300 activities. And from year 7 up to year 9, the kids would spend one of the 5 periods a week in that room going through the problems, and we'd sit and help the kids. And then the teacher aide would tick off and keep a record of all the problems that the kids did. So I would do the typical textbook worked example things for 4 periods, and then they do this 1 period of the Maths Task Centre. And what I noticed was the engagement. Now, I know the science of learning people say engagement's not learning. I've heard that, and I'm sort of sick of that argument, to be honest.
Yes, that is a very common retort, right? Engagement is a poor proxy for learning. That and project follow through.
Yeah, that's another one. But what I noticed was these kids would be engaged. So I just noticed the big difference. So that really had an impact on me. And then ever since then, I mean, problem-based learning is not a big part of what I teach, because I've mostly been involved in our year 11 and 12 maths, which is a set curriculum, and there's a real hurry to get through all of the dot points because the kids have an external exam at the end of year 12.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really trying to get through all the dot points throughout the year, and you don't have time really to do investigations and stuff. So you're most of the time working from a textbook, trying to get the kids to practice, trying to get them to do their homework, trying to question, trying to see if they understand, like all of those things that the Science of Learning people recommend. But there's a sort of dissatisfaction in that rush. I find a dissatisfaction that we're not dealing with the sort of maths that the kids might enjoy. In the middle years, and you have got a little bit of room to do that, and I've tried to do that. For example, one of the things, I was at a sports school for a little while, and I'm always trying to figure out how can we relate, Pythagoras to what the kids' experience is. How can we relate trigonometry to what the kids are doing? So, I think a lot about that. So, I was at a sports school that actually try to set up kids to have scholarships to American colleges. And one of our guys is actually playing he went number one, a guy called Ben Simmons. He came through, I think he's playing for LA Clippers now. But I'm not really a basketball fan, but NFL fan, though. I follow the New Orleans Saints, but they're not doing so well. But so I try and do all of that. And then Australian football's big here. So I try and link in the maths, and I've done a lot of sports science with Australian football teams, measuring how far players run in a game, what energy systems they use, all that, those sorts of things. So I try and do some projects that involve that, but it's not a lot. I find when you do that, sometimes the project's a bit too complicated for the kids. They do need a lot of guidance and they need a lot of help. And it's much easier to use a textbook. So, but so I've sort of run around the question a little bit, because I think it's very hard to tell a new teacher what to do. What I try and do is give them, a bag of different things that they could do, and I'd encourage them to consider certain types of problems and show them some problems that really engage kids, and how that would work in the class. And in my teacher training, that's how I was trained. I was given a whole range of things that I could do in various circumstances, and I think that's a healthy way to go.
Yeah, well, there's a few things, and I've touched on these in other conversations, but I think they're important. Is that one, the matter of efficiency, and that is something that seems to be really paramount to sort of science of learning, and it is important. Just like I think it's important to say the idea that engagement is a poor proxy for learning is true. But that doesn't mean that engagement isn't important, or that project follow-through doesn't have some important lessons to take, but we should also be thoughtful and critique those kinds of things. And so when we look at the landscape of teaching and learning and what it looks like in the classroom, in this classroom, and not just some theoretical classroom, to your point, there are some dynamics and factors that we have to take into account, and interest and motivation and attention and engagement is one of them. Now, one way to do that, especially according to some of the folks like the Step Lab folks, and maybe Doug Lemov and Teach Like a Champion or whatever, is a very rigid, structured, Rachel Jefferson would say, control and command kind of thing. And I suppose that can work if, Catherine Burbelsing, who's been on the podcast more than once, and, I would say that probably fits that sort of mold. It's not how I would want to learn and teach, or probably would necessarily want my students or my daughters to attend or be a part of. And again, there's gradations there, but then there are other schools and teachers who are going after some of those same dynamics, but just in a little bit different way. They might be less efficient. But the other thing that strikes me is that as you think about teaching math, and you've probably seen me say this, is that the lot of the rhetoric and advocacy that comes with the direct and explicit instruction, I sometimes call it evangelism because it feels like that, seems to come and emanate from a math teaching perspective, which makes, I think, a little bit more sense because it's a little bit more linear and foundational, and you do need to know multiplication facts. You do need to know, some order of operations and things like that. The cognitive load becomes a real issue. But as a former social studies teacher and a psychology teacher, some of those bigger questions that I think knowledge obviously is important for, but inquiry, I think, is a really powerful tool in those contexts that operates probably, I think it's fair to say, in a different way than a math teacher and math course might need or desire, which doesn't mean that you can't or shouldn't use some inquiry elements in a math course, but perhaps it is a bit more oriented towards something like, explicit instruction. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I mean, you're right that most of the research does seem to be about maths and science, and that's one of the criticisms. In fact, the Education Endowment Foundation had a big study that's worthwhile reading. It talks about that there needs to be more studies of cognitive science over a range of different subjects rather than it's a bit too focused on maths and science. I mean, there are some studies coming out now, but there's lots to. Sorry, the one thing I didn't mention about my maths teaching before was one of the strategies that is a little bit controversial at the moment with the science is the productive failure type of stuff. So I've looked into that quite a bit, and I've found there's lots of layers to that. I don't use it a lot, but there's a number of people that talk about when you've got older kids and they're not interested, how do you get them interested? And I've seen that the productive failure type of way does somehow raise their interest. Now, I wouldn't use it all the time, but it's one of those tricks in the tool bag sort of things. And then your podcast a little while ago with Christian Bookove, Dylan William, Carl, and I thought that was really Christian's got some good. He talks about the language. He says, because the science of learning, people will really pick up on the struggle, productive struggle. You partly kids struggle, you're going to hurt them, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then it's just why don't you call it optimizing their cognitive load, changing the language, and then all of a sudden it's okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's all that. Another aspect of this sort of top down, which is starting to happen here. We've sort of, we've got a fairly strict government now that's looks like they're aligning with the science of learning. So we've sort of gone through the Hattie phase. Now it looks like we're going to go through the cognitive load phase. It looks like. I think we're going to find the same problems that we had with Hattie, that it's not really going to change much. But one of the things, Ollie Cav on your podcast talked about the split attention, when you put up slides and you talk, and about how if you say you talk with the slide on, the science of learning people, or some of them will come down and go, it's against cognitive load theory. And it becomes, some of this evidence-based stuff becomes really trivial, and it becomes almost like, and it did happen in my state. The similar example was Hattie's learning intention, that at one point in my school, it was mandated you had to write a learning intention on the board. And then I had an appraisal by the vice principal. So I had a year 11 class, and we're doing solving simultaneous equations, which any maths teacher knows. All of those sorts of things are written in the textbook. There are headings, subheadings, and that I forgot to write, because the learning intention to me is not important, like compared to teaching the class. So I forgot to write the learning intention on the board. And so I failed the observation because of that triviality. And it's like, that was another thing that fired me up about evidence. It's like, if we're going to this is not healthy, that all the other aspects of my lesson, that I engaged the kids, that I did teach them, they practice, the kids were happy, they were, all of those sorts of things weren't looked at. It was just that I didn't write the learning intention on the board, and that was like what was mandated. Then I tried to argue, well, the learning intention's in the textbook. It's like solving simultaneous equations are the only thing I would change is today, kids, we're going to teach you how to solve simultaneous equations. So, like, what's the point of that? Anyway, and I see some of this science of learning stuff getting towards that sort of pedanticness. People will get criticised. I remember one of my colleagues, she presented a picture book when she was teaching some kids to read. She got hammered for showing a picture book. Because it's like 3 queuing, and it's 3 queuing. I just think that's unhealthy, and it doesn't represent the teaching profession very well. But and I did like Dylan's comment, or Dylan's words on your podcast a few weeks ago, where he talks about cognitive load's an important thing to know, but it's not everything.
Well, I think that's a really a perfect example of how a group, a tribal group, or a group of folks who are tribally activated, and in this case on the sort of science of learning, direct instruction, there's a quote from Dylan William that says cognitive load theory is the most important thing for teachers to know, or something along those lines. And what is, I think on my podcast and probably in other places, he's clarified to say, of the things that they probably don't know much about or enough about.
Yeah.
Right?
That changes it all, doesn't it?
Right. It changes quite a bit. But the folks who are really evangelists will say, cognitive load theory is the most important thing for teachers to know, full stop, and not look into any more nuance or complexity, probably because it's menacing. But that's a really perfect example. And maybe an example on the other end of the spectrum is something like, kids don't need to know stuff; they can just Google it or whatever. And I would and do push back on that quite a bit as well. But we get these little things that, like, okay, that's my cudgel, that's my wedge. If somebody says, well, what about this? And you say, well, cognitive load theory is the most important thing to know. Okay. And away we go. And it stops the conversation. One of the things, and I'm mindful of time, so I want to wrap us up here, but one of the things that I wonder about and have concerns about, and I think it's important to critique and question, but also give grace and not assume. But, like I see step lab videos of choral response and things like that, and more power to them if that's the way that you want your kid to learn. If that's the way you want to teach, I as a student probably would have opted out of it if I was old enough to feel empowered to do so. Chanting and things like that would seem to be weird to me. But all of that said, is one of the things I wonder about and have concerns about is there's so much focus on knowledge building, and I hear kids getting the answers right, or being in agreement with the teacher on what the answer is or should be, but there's not enough evidence that I'm seeing from those folks that they're taking that next step, which is understanding. Do they understand it? Are they making meaning of it? How do they think about it? How are they making meaning of it? And I think, you mentioned Oliver several times. His question that he posed on the podcast, or one of the times I talked with him, was something like, or maybe it was on social media, something like, we're so focused on knowledge building and how do we get kids to remember things and get them into long-term memory, but the question that doesn't seem to be asked enough, and again, I'm probably butchering Oliver's words here, but something like, what if we can get it into long-term memory? Then what? Like, what are we doing with it, right? Because it feels like this sort of shallow kind of learning process and focus, because you need knowledge to do critical thinking, which I disagree with, and that's maybe another podcast. But just a qualifier, I think you need knowledge to do deep critical thinking, but you can do shallow critical thinking. But
that's the argument.
Yeah. So, do you think that's a valid concern? Because I want to assume that they are getting to understanding, and that they are getting past just that knowledge, but I so rarely see evidence of that in what they share.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's those claims that somehow or other. I was reading all about that yesterday, actually, because there's been an article written by one of the professors here that the science of learning people have started to criticise really about about
Mm-hmm.
Does direct instruction teach those deeper things that skills and so anyway, so the reference was Rosenstein. So I wasted a bit of time, a couple of hours yesterday reading some Rosenstein stuff. A couple of it, I mean, he links to the process product research, of which Brophy and Good so I read it. Actually, the Brophy study I read yesterday speaks against the choral responses. So I'll send that to you. It's like, because I teach mostly 16, 17-year-olds, that the choral response thing, I've always that's not going to work for me. Like these kids, suburban kids, is like they'll look at you with a crooked eye, and it's like you're going to treat us like little kids. But I was surprised to read the Brophy thing, where I think it's a study in Texas where for little kids, he shows that the choral responses didn't work as well as just the teacher trying to get individual responses from kids. So he writes a lot about that, and also actually about, which is interesting, trying to get kids to think deeper. And so the Brophy article talks about just asking questions at the start to sort of almost warm kids up to thinking about the problem, to get them to self-reflect, to talk aloud, to think out loud, to just those sorts of simple strategies gets the article claims can get kids to think deeper. I'll send that to you if you want to. But I thought it was a little bit different to the way, once again, the science of learning people are saying choral responses work for everybody and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, they're all. When actually the papers talk about how hard it is how do you measure all that stuff?
Right.
Like in order to measure it, basically, you have to sit down and have a conversation one-on-one.
Right, which is terribly inefficient.
Yeah, and you get the kids to explain themselves, to explain what they've learned. That seems to be one of the few ways that you can work out whether it's actually happened or not. Well, I mean, that's not going to happen too soon, like those sorts of measurements.
Right.
But
yeah, that's why I love the work of the thinking routines and Project Zeros and Harvard Project Zero, Ron Richart, and I would categorize most of those thinking routines in the inquiry bucket, but yeah, you've got to have a conversation. I don't know if you're familiar with Christian Moore Anderson. He's a teacher in Spain, and he's written a book about biology. He's actually got a new book. I was giving him some feedback on. And some of his work, I think, will be. I'm looking forward to that book getting out there. But he makes that point is that there's a sort of first order reality, which is the sort of knowledge that it's presented and transmitted to a kid. But then there's a second order reality, which is how do they make meaning of it. And the way in which we figure that out is, as you said, is to have a conversation of some sort. And just doing choral response or asking kids to answer on a test doesn't necessarily mean that they are making meaning of it and understand it. They could just be getting the answer right. And there is, I think, a really important difference there.
Yeah, no, big difference. Yeah, it's really hard. I remember one story related to that. I was at a really high performing school that was really easy to teach maths, where the kids come to learn, because of their parents. I guess there's a big social capital that, which was very different to that other school that I talked about, where we had a lot of African refugees. And so I'm always we're teaching gradient. I don't know, the gradient's a common thing that you teach. Gradient and straight lines are pretty common around the world, that we all teach the same thing, and trying to get the rise over the run, the horizontal versus the vertical. And at the time I was reading John Gottman's research on marriage, and he talks about measuring the positive versus negative comments that partners make to each other. And so I don't know, I started prattling on about that to the kids, about how, that this research says. It's like gradient. It's like for every negative comment, you've got to give 5 positives. It's like, so that's sort of a way to talk about gradient.
Right.
And anyway, so I was trying to explain to the kids that way, and trying to relate it to their own relationships and stuff. Then a couple of days later, I think I cracked it. The kids didn't do their homework, and so I really had to go at the class. And one girl put up a hand and said, "Sir, okay, you made one. Now you've got to give us 5 good comments." And at that point, I realised she understood in a deep way what I was talking about. That interaction.
Right. Yeah. I mean, great comedians are really smart, critical thinkers, but because they to set up and write a good joke, which is essentially what this student was doing, is you have to understand it, right? Yeah. It reminds me years ago. I'll maybe end us on this. So I used to teach psychology, and one of the things I would do around Christmas time was to read Christmas carols for the mentally challenged or mentally ill or something, some version of that. And of course, you had to understand the concepts to get the joke, right? So like Jingle Bell, or like somebody with OCD would be obsessive compulsive disorder would be jingle bells, jingle bells, jingle bells, jingle bells. They're stuck in this loop, right? So you have to understand it, and to your point, it sounds like she was demonstrating some understanding, and that's obviously important. Well, Georgia, we could talk for hours, and maybe we'll do it again sometime. I haven't done one of the salons in a while, but maybe I'll try to set another one of those up and include you in one of those. It's hard to get everybody on different time zones. You're in Australia, and somebody like Carl's in the UK, and here I'm in the States, whatever. But I know you have a blog, and you mentioned it a couple times. I want to give you an opportunity to make sure that folks hear that. We'll put it in the show notes, and any other things that you want to mention as far as that goes, and anything that you want to mention that we haven't talked about before we sign off.
Thanks, Drew, and I really appreciate your podcast. That it's one of the few places where people with consenting views can come on. So it's refreshing. You put on people that, disagree with your views, and I think we need more of that. We need more people coming together that have different views to try and talk through all of these things. I think that will get us a lot further than the sort of tribalism that we seem to be stuck in at the moment. So thank you for the time and effort that you put in. If you can get a few people together, I'm happy. Even the great guru himself, Mr. Hattie, I'm happy to sit and talk with him. He's indirectly responded to some. He's never directly responded, but he's indirectly responded to some of the things I've written that we can talk about another time. But
but the blog address, and where should people find you?
It's at visiblelearningblogspot.com.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, we'll put that in the show notes. And you're on X?
Just George _Lilley, GOR, but George is spelled GORGE _LILLEY. Yeah.
Well, we'll be sure to also include that in the show notes. Well, it's good to actually talk after years. Like, I was trying to figure out when, like I said, you first came on my radar, and it's been a number of years, and I appreciate the conversation and the social media contributions, even though they seem to go unresponded to by certainly some of the folks that you, I'm sure, would like to get a response from. But thanks for the conversation.
Thanks, Drew. All the best, mate.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.